at 7 Eastern here on C-SPAN. And this weekend on America and the Courts, Scripps College in California awards its highest honor to Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. America and the Courts this Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific. Next, author Gore Vidal. This afternoon at the Nat'l Press Club, he talked about the U.S. role in the world, the National Security Act, and the Constitution. Following his remarks, he took questions from the Press Club audience. The event's about an hour.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. This is our 90th anniversary year. My name is Doug Harbrecht. I'm president of the National Press Club and Washington News editor of Business Week magazine, a McGraw-Hill Companies publication. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind our members of some upcoming speakers. Tomorrow, Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman will speak about food safety. And our last speaker in March will be James Wolfenson, president of the World Bank, speaking on March 25th. In April, we'll hear Michel Comdessous, managing director of the International Monetary Fund, on April 2nd. Stephen Goldstone, chair and CEO of JR Nabisco, on April 3rd. Mac McLarty, counselor to the president and special envoy to the Americas, on April 9th. Marvin Runyon, postmaster general, on April 14th. Charles Rosati, commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, will appear, of course, on tax day, April 15th. Zoe Caldwell, actor and winner of the 1998 Sir John Gielgud Award, will speak on April 17th. Transcripts and audio files of National Press Club luncheons will be posted this afternoon at our website, npc.press.org. To purchase audio and videotapes, call 1-888-343-1940. If you have any questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards provided at your table and pass them up to me. I will ask as many as time permits. I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. Please hold your applause until all head table guests have been introduced. From your right, Jeffrey Dvorkin, Vice President for News, National Public Radio. Russell Mokaber, Corporate Crime Reporter. Andy Glass, Cox Newspapers. Bob Murray, Publisher, Congressional Quarterly. Godfrey Sperling, Christian Science Monitor. Marcus Raskin, co-founder of the Institute for Policy Studies. Fred Kaplan, professor, City University of New York, and a biographer of our guest today. Ken Esky, chairman of the Speakers Committee. Skipping over our speaker for just a moment. Gil Klein, media general and former president of the National Press Club, who arranged today's lunch. And the remainder of our head table will be introduced in just a minute. But first, we have some good news to share. It is said that every reporter has the first chapter of the great American novel buried in his bottom desk drawer, just waiting for the time and inspiration to turn it into a best-selling, fame-attracting, money-making prose. To test that theory, the National Press Club holds an annual fiction writing contest for our members. This year, the contest was judged by two literary agents, Nina Graybill and Jenny Bent. And here are the results. Honorable mention goes to freelance writer Elizabeth Shevchuk Armstrong for a chapter from her historical novel, Hotspur. Elizabeth, would you come up, please? Second honorable mention goes to Ron Geigley of Geigley and Associates for his story, The Woods. Ron? Now the ribbons. The third prize goes to Stephanie Fall for a chapter of her novel entitled Tag City. Stephanie has now won first, second, and third prize in the 5 years of this contest, yet inexplicably, she's still working for the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. Second prize goes to Grant Dillman. Grant, who was UPI bureau chief, literally had this novel entitled Impatient Mistress in his bottom drawer for decades. He started writing it during the Johnson administration, when he concluded someone would have to be crazy to want to be president. It's the story of a president who suffers from schizophrenia, and the wire service reporter, I wonder who that is, who finds out about it despite the White House's best efforts to conceal it. Grant.
Thank you very much.
And first prize goes to Keith Epstein, Washington correspondent for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, for his story entitled Homecoming. This story grew out of Epstein's coverage of pilots returning from the Gulf War, especially when a 4-year-old girl rushed out to greet her daddy. It deals with the psychological effects of being away from home for a year and of the mental impact of the smart bombs on the pilots who fired them. Well, congratulations to you all. And now to our speaker. Today we are pleased to have with us Mr. Gore Vidal, a man who has been described, not by himself, but by the Boston Globe, as our greatest living man of letters. Back when Mr. Vidal was beginning his trade, he shocked the public by writing about sex and scandal in Washington. Now, of course, any two-bit White House correspondent can get more salacious stuff than he was writing about back that used to upset the blue bloods back in the 50s. So what is Vidal writing about now? The Smithsonian Institution. That's the title of his latest book. But I have to tell you, this is not your father's Smithsonian Institution. Somehow this is a 13-year-old who's involved in time travel, who goes to the basement of the Smithsonian Institution, gets involved in time travel to develop the atomic bomb in the 30s. This is eventually Mrs. Grover Cleveland. Let me tell you, this is one weird book. And a lot of fun to read, but I hope he'll explain more about it to us today. The last time Mr. Vidal spoke here in 1994, he had already been at our podium about a dozen times. And his father, an aviation pioneer, as well as his grandfather, Senator Thomas Pryor Gore of Oklahoma, spoke here as well. One can imagine in the Vidal homestead in Ravello, Italy, shelf upon shelf of National Press Club mugs dating back to the early part of the 20th century. So it is only fitting that he speak to us just days before our 90th anniversary. Young Gore Vidal grew up in Washington, immersed in its politics as he read the congressional record to his blind grandfather, Senator Gore. His first historical novel was entitled Washington, D.C., and it delved into the underside of Washington politics of the 1950s. It served as a foundation for a series of novels that chronicle American history, including Burr, Lincoln, 1876, Empire, and Hollywood. They search, sometimes in vain, for the nation's great promise. Few contemporary writers have generated as much controversy as Gore Vidal. In his 23 novels, 2 plays, and many, many essays, not to mention countless television appearances, Mr. Vidal has dissected every aspect of American history, politics, and life. And he is here to do it again for us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm National Press Club welcome for Mr. Gore Vidal. Thank you.
I first spoke here in 1961, and I have mixed feelings about the press, as everybody does, but you are the most wonderful audience because you eat lunch faster than any group that I have ever talked to. I mean, it is such a joy. It's just over like that. And we can get down to the really serious stuff about Monica and Kathleen's correspondence, to really important subjects. But before we get to that, I planned just a little foreplay here about the origins of the American empire and the meaning of the Cold War, how it started, who started it, who benefited. Because here we are at the 20th century, and the second Christian millennium are heading hand in hand for the exit. Personally, I thought they'd never go without taking us with them. We've still got about 700 more days, so fingers are crossed. We all know that centuries and millennia are just arbitrary markings, a bit like the bookkeeping at Paramount Pictures. I see some of you have made movie sales. But symbolically, they mean a lot to those who are interested in why we are today what we are and doing what we are doing. This goes particularly for the one indisposable, or did the president say indispensable, nation on earth, and the last self-styled global empire loaded down with nukes, bases, and debts. I should note here that I have now lived through nearly 3/4 of this century. I enlisted in the Army of the United States at 17, went to the Pacific, did nothing useful. I was just there, as Richard M. Nixon used to say, when the bombs were falling. Actually, the bombs are not really falling on either one of us. I was writing a novel, and he was making a fortune playing poker. Now, suddenly, it's 1998. I never thought I'd see that happen. And last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Also, more ominously, last July 26 was the 50th anniversary of the National Security Act that, without any national debate or the people's consent, replaced the old American Republic with a national security state very much in the global empire business, which explains, but first let us get into the time machine. It is the Ides of August, 1945. Germany and Japan have surrendered, and some 13 million Americans are headed home to enjoy, well, the bottom line was always being alive. Home turned out to be a sort of fairground where fireworks go off and the band plays Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree, and an endlessly enticing funhouse flings open its doors and we file through. We enjoy halls of mirrors where everyone is comically distorted, ride through all the various tunnels of love, and take scary tours of horror chambers where skeletons and cobwebs and bats brush past us. And suitably chilled and thrilled, we're ready for the exit in everyday life. But, to the consternation of some and the apparent indifference of the rest, we were never really allowed to leave the funhouse. It has become a permanent part of our world, as were those goblins sitting under the apple tree. Officially, the United States was at peace. Much of Europe and most of Japan were in ruins, often literally. certainly economically. We alone had all our cities and a sort of booming economy, sort of, because it depended on war production. And there was, as far as anyone can tell, no war in the offing. Briefly, the arts flourished. It looked like it was going to be a golden age. The Glass Menagerie was staged. Copland's Appalachian Spring was played. A film called The Lost Weekend, not a bad title for what we'd gone through, won an Academy Award, and the as yet unexiled Richard Wright published a much-admired work, Black Boy. While Edmund Wilson's Memoirs of Hecate County was banned for obscenity in parts of the country, though it would be allowed out today in Washington, D.C. Quaintly, each city had at least 3 or 4 daily newspapers, while New York, as befitted the world's capital, had 17 newspapers. But a novelty, television, had begun to appear in household after household, its cold, gray, distorting eye relentlessly projecting a fun house view of the world. Those who followed the ugly new minted word media began to note that often while watching television, we kept fading in and out of a chamber of horrors. Our ally in the recent war, Uncle Joe Stalin, as the accidental President Harry S. Truman called him, was growing horns and fangs that dripped blood. On Earth, we were the only great unruined power with atomic weapons, yet we were somehow at terrible risk. Why? How? The trouble appeared to be over Germany, which on February 11th, 1945, had been split at the Yalta Summit meeting into 4 zones: American, Soviet, British, and French. As the Russians had done the most fighting and suffered the greatest losses, it was agreed that they should have an early crack at reparations from Germany to the extent of $20 billion. At a later meeting at Potsdam, the new President Truman, with Stalin and Churchill, reconfirmed Yalta and opted for the unification of Germany under the 4 victorious powers. But something had happened between the euphoria of Yalta and the edginess of Potsdam. As the meeting progressed, the atom bomb was tried out successfully in a New Mexico desert. We were now able to incinerate Japan, or the Soviet for that matter, and we no longer needed Russian help to defeat Japan. We started to renege on our agreements with Stalin, particularly reparations from Germany. We also quietly shelved the notion, agreed upon at Yalta, of a united Germany under 4-power control. Our aim now was to unite the 3 western zones of Germany and integrate them into our Western Europe, restoring in the process Germany's economy, hence fewer reparations. Then, as of May 1946, we began to rearm Germany. Stalin went up the wall at this betrayal. The Cold War was on. At home, the media was beginning to prepare the attentive few for disappointment. Suddenly, we were faced with the highest personal income taxes in American history to pay for more and more weapons, among them the world killer hydrogen bomb. Why? Because the Russians were coming. No one knew quite why they were coming or with what. Weren't they still burying 20 million dead? Official explanations for all this made very little sense. But then, as Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, merrily observed, in the State Department, we used to discuss how much time that mythical average American citizen put in each day listening, reading, and arguing about the world outside his country. It seemed to us that 10 minutes a day would be a high average. So why bore the people? Secret bipartisan government is best for what, after all, is or should be a society of docile workers, enthusiastic consumers, obedient soldiers who will believe just about anything for at least 10 minutes. The national security state, the NATO alliance, the 40 years Cold War were all created without the consent, much less the advice of the American people. Of course, there were elections during the crucial time, but Truman, Dewey, Eisenhower, Stevenson, Kennedy, Nixon were of a single mind as to the desirability of inventing first a many-tentacled enemy, communism, the star of the Chamber of Horrors, then to combat so much evil, install a permanent wartime state at home with loyalty oaths, a national peacetime draft, and secret police to keep watch over homegrown traitors, as the few enemies of the national security state were known. Then followed 40 years of mindless wars which created a debt of $5 trillion that hugely benefited aerospace and firms like General Electric, whose longtime TV spokesman, Ronald Reagan, was eventually retired to the White House. Why go into all of this now? Have we not done marvelously well as the United States of amnesia? Certainly European bankers envious our powerless labor unions. Only 14% of the lucky fundsters are privileged to belong to a labor union, and our industries, lean, mean, downsized, with no particular place for the redundant to go except into the hell of sizzle and fry and burn. Today, we give orders to every country on our globe, tell them with whom to trade and to which of our courts they must show up for indictment should they disobey us. Yet something omnious, as Darryl Zanuck used to say, no one ever corrected him either. Something really omnious is happening. We have come to what Tennessee Williams once called a moon of pause. When I asked him, what on earth does that mean, Tennessee? It is, he said loftily, the actual Greek translation of menopause. I said that the word moon did not come from menses, Latin, not Greek, for month. Then what, he asked suspiciously, is the Latin for moon? And I told him it was luna and all the fun that he might have. With the word lunatic, he sighed and cut. But suddenly, summer before last, at the Madrid conference about the extension of NATO, which Senator Lott has just said is of no interest for a debate in the Senate, a moon of pause seemed a nice dotty phrase for the change of life that our empire is now going through with no enemy and no discernible function. While we were at our busiest in the funhouse, no one ever told us what the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was really about. March 17, 1948, the Treaty of Brussels called for a military alliance of Britain, France, Benelux to be joined by the US and Canada on March 23rd. The impetus behind NATO was the United States, whose principal foreign policy, since the administration of George Washington, was to avoid entangling alliances. Now, as the Russians were supposed to be coming, we replaced the old republic with a newborn national security state and set up shop as the major European power west of the Elbe. We were now hell-bent on the permanent division of Germany between our western zone, plus the French and British zones, and the Soviet sector to the east. Serenely, we broke every agreement that we had made with our former ally, now horrendous communist enemy. For those interested in the details, Carolyn Eisenberg's, she happens to be in the room now, I'm told, Drawing the Line, the American Decision to Divide Germany, 1944-49, is a masterful survey of an empire, sometimes blindly, sometimes brilliantly, assembling itself, first its allies, and turning them and its enemies like Germany, Italy, Japan, into client states, permanently subject to our military and economic diktat. Although the Soviets still wanted to live by our original arrangements at Yalta and even Potsdam, we had decided unilaterally to restore the German economy in order to enfold a rearmed Germany into Western Europe, thus isolating the Soviet, a nation which had not recovered from the Second World War and had no nuclear weapons. It was Dean Acheson again who elegantly explained all the lies that he was obliged to tell Congress and the 10-minute attention span average American. This is gorgeous stuff, by the way. If we did make our points, this is Acheson writing in his memoirs, if we did make our points clearer than truth, isn't that glorious? Clearer than truth. We did not differ from most other educators and could hardly do otherwise. Qualification must give way to simplicity of statement, nicety and nuance to bluntness, almost brutality in carrying home a point. Thus were two generations of Americans conditioned by their overlords so that at the word communism, there is a Pavlovian reflex as the brain goes totally dead. In regard to the enemy, Ambassador to Moscow, Walter Bedell Smith, wrote in December 1947, apropos a conference to regularize European matters, "The difficulty," he wrote, "under which we labor is that in spite of our announced position, we really do not want nor intend to accept German unification in any terms the Russians might agree to, even though they seem to meet most of our requirements." This is higher diplomacy. Hence Stalin's frustration that led to the famous blockade of the Allied section of Berlin, overcome by General Lucius Clay's successful airlift. As Eisenberg writes, with the inception of the Berlin blockade, President Truman articulated a simple story that featured the Russians trampling the wartime agreements in their ruthless grab for the former German capital. The president did not explain that the United States had abandoned Yalta and Potsdam, that it was pushing the formation of a West German state against the misgivings of many Europeans, and that the Soviets had launched the blockade to prevent partition. This was funhouse politics at its most tragical. The case for an American world empire was never properly argued since the debate, what little there was, centered on the alleged desire of the Soviet Union to conquer the whole world, just as Hitler and the Nazis were trying to do until stopped in 1945. On March 12, 1947, Truman addressed Congress to proclaim what would be known as the Truman Doctrine, in which he targeted our ally of 2 years earlier as the enemy. The subject at hand was a civil war in Greece, supposedly directed by the Soviet. We could not tolerate this as suddenly, this is his quotation, "The policy of the United States is to support free peoples who are resisting attempted suppression of personal freedom." Thus, Truman made the entire world the specific business of the United States. Although Greek insurgents were getting some help from Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, the Soviet gave none. Russia stayed out. They still hoped that the British, whose business Greece had been, would keep order. But as Britain had neither the resources nor the will, they called on the US to step in. Behind the usual closed doors, Acheson was stirring up Congress with Iago-like intensity. Russian pressure of some sort, he said, has brought the Balkans to the point where a highly possible Soviet breakthrough might open 3 continents to Soviet penetration. Senators gasped, grew pale, wondered how to get more defense contracts into their states. Of the major politicians, only former Vice President Henry Wallace dared answer Truman's clearer-than-truth version of history. Wallace said yesterday, March 12th, 1947, marked a turning point in American history, for it is not a Greek crisis that we face. It is an American crisis. Yesterday, President Truman proposed, in effect, that America police Russia's every border. There is no regime too reactionary for us, provided it stands in Russia's expansionist path. There is no country too remote to serve as the scene of a contest which may widen until it becomes a world war. 9 days after Truman declared war on communism, he installed a federal loyalty oath program. All government employees must now swear allegiance to the new order. Henry Wallace struck again. The President's executive order creates a master index of public servants, from the janitor in the village post office to the cabinet members. They are to be sifted and tested and watched and appraised. Truman was nervously aware that many regarded Wallace as true heir to Roosevelt's New Deal. Wallace was also likely to enter the presidential race of 1948. Truman now left truth behind in the dust. Here's his quote: "The attempt of Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin et al. To fool the world and the American Crackpots Association, represented by Joe Davies, Henry Wallace, Claude Pepper, and the actors and artists in immoral Greenwich Village. It's just like Hitler's and Mussolini's so-called socialist states. Give them hell, Harry." In the wake of Truman's cuckoo-like emergence from the old-fashioned closet of the American Republic, a new American state was being born in order to save the nation and the great globe itself from communism. The nature of this militarized state was from the beginning beyond rational debate. Characteristically, Truman and Atchison insisted on closed hearings of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. These matters were too important to share with a people whose spare 10 minutes was now more and more filling up with television. The media spoke with a single voice. Time Life publisher Henry Luce said it loudest: "God has founded America as a global beacon of freedom." He once said to me, "The great task for the United States in the American century is the Christianization of China." I remember thinking then we were really in trouble. It's before I knew this background, which is now coming out. Dissenters like Wallace were labeled communists and ceased to engage meaningfully in public life. An ancestral voice in his own time, he spoke on May 21st, 1947. "Today, in blind fear of communism, we are turning aside from the United Nations. We are approaching a century of fear." And thus far, he's proved to be half right. On July 26, 1947, Congress enacted the National Security Act, which created the National Security Council, still going strong, and the Central Intelligence Agency, still apparently going over a cliff as the result of decades of bad intelligence, not to mention all those cheery traitors for whom the country club at Langley, Virginia was once an impenetrable cover. When the original North American Treaty Organization was created, only the Augustus Manquet de Gaulle got the point of what we were doing. He took France out of our Cosa Nostra and developed his own atomic bomb. But France was still very much linked to the Imperium, though through the CIA and other secret forces. Political control was exerted within the empire, not only driving the Labor Prime Minister Harold Wilson around a bend too far, but preventing Italy from ever having a cohesive government by not allowing the historic compromise a government of Christian Democrats and communists. The Soviet, always reactive, promptly cracked down on their client states, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, and a wall went up in Berlin to spite their face, not ours. From 1950 to 1990, Europe was dangerously divided and armed to the teeth. But as American producers of weapons were never richer, all was well with their world. At Yalta, Roosevelt wanted to break up the European colonial empires, particularly that of the French. Of Indochina, FDR said, France has milked it for 100 years. For the time being, he proposed a UN trusteeship. Then he died. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman was not a philatelist. Had he been a stamp collector, he might have known where the various countries in the world were and who lived in them. Like every good American, he knew he hated communism. He also hated socialism, which may or may not have been the same thing. No one was ever quite sure. Yet as early as the American election of 1848, socialism, imported by comical German immigrants with noses always in books, was an ominous specter, calculated to enrage a raw capitalist society with labor unions, health care, and other devil's work, still being fiercely resisted a century and a half later. In 1946, when Ho Chi Minh asked the United States to take Indochina under its wing, Truman said, "No way, you're some kind of Fu Manchu communist, the worst." In August 1945, Truman told de Gaulle that the French could return to Indochina. We were no longer FDR anti-imperialists. As Ho had his Northern Republic, the French installed Bao Dai in the south. February 1st, 1950, the State Department, of all places, came to this extraordinary conclusion. This is their report. The choice confronting the United States is to support the French in Indochina or face the extension of communism over the remainder of the continental area of Southeast Asia and possibly further westward. Thus, without shepherds or even a napalm star, the domino theory was born in a humble State Department manger. On May 8, 1950, Atchison recommended economic and military aid to the French in Vietnam. By 1955, the U.S. was paying 40% of the French cost of that war. For a quarter century, the United States was to fight in Vietnam because our ignorant leaders and their sharp-eyed financiers never realized that the game is not dominoes, but chess. Happily, nothing ever stays the same. During the last days of the waning moon, a haphazard Western European Economic Union has been cobbled together. Then, as the Soviet, demonstrating its pure viciousness, abruptly folded, the two Germanys, leaving us high and dry and petulant, the two Germanys that we had so painstakingly kept apart reunited. Washington was suddenly adrift, and in the sky the moon of empire paused. Neither Reagan nor Bush had much knowledge of history or geography. Nevertheless, orders still kept coming from the White House, but they were less and less heeded because everyone knew that the Oval One had a bank overdraft of $5 trillion, and he could no longer give presents to good clients or wage war without first passing the hat to the Germans and the Japanese, as he was obliged to do when Ted Turner had his light show for CNN in the Persian Gulf. Gradually, it is now becoming evident to even the most distracted fundster that there is no longer any need for NATO because there is no enemy. One might say there never really was one, even when NATO was started. But over the years, we did succeed in creating a pretty dangerous Soviet, a funhouse mirror version of ourselves. Although the United States may yet, in support of Israel, declare war on 1 billion Muslims, the Europeans will stay out of that one. They recall 1529 when Turks besieged Vienna, not as obliging guest workers, but as world conquerors. Never again. The time has now come for the Europeans to free themselves of their American masters. Our motive for hanging on to empire is obvious. With an expanded NATO, our arms makers, if not workers, are in for a bonanza. As it is, American sale of weapons went up 23% last year, while restrictions on sales to Latin America are being lifted. Chile, ever menaced by Ecuador, plans to buy 24 F-16 jet fighters. But it is an expanded NATO that causes true joy in the boardrooms. Upon joining NATO, the lucky new club member is obliged to buy expensive weapons from the likes of Lockheed Martin, recently merged with Northrop Grumman. Since the new members have precarious economies and the old ones are not exactly booming, the American taxpayer, a wan goose that lays few eggs, will have to borrow even more money to foot the bill, which the Congressional Budget Office says should come to $125 billion over 15 years, with the U.S. paying most of it. Yeltsin correctly sees this as a hostile move against Russia, not to mention an expensive renewal of the Cold War. There comes a moment when empires cease to exert energy and become symbolic or existential, as we used to say back in the 40s. The current wrangling over NATO demonstrates what a quandary a symbolic empire is in when it wants to maintain its view of itself at home and abroad, and yet lacks the mind, much less the resources, to impose its hegemony upon its former client states. Happily, in the absence of money and common will, nothing much will probably happen. Meanwhile, there's a new and better world ready to be born. The optimum economic unit in the world is now the city-state. Thanks to technology, everyone knows or can know something about everyone else on the planet. The message now pounding in over the internet is the irrelevancy, not to mention the sheer danger of the traditional nation-state, much less empire. Currently, the warlord bankers at Peking are tolerating not only vigorous semi-autonomies like Shanghai, but they are enjoying Hong Kong for the present. We may not like the way Singapore is run, though we seem to be imitating their politics by suing in the courts our political enemies, thus breaking them. But it is, relatively speaking, a greater commercial success, perhaps even than the United States. In the next century, barring accident, the common euro market will evolve not so much into a union of ancient blood-stained states as a mosaic of homogeneous regions like the Spanish-French Basques, or city-states like Milan, each loosely linked in trade with a clearinghouse information center at Brussels. They would orchestrate finance and trade and the policing of cartels. Basques, Bretons, Walloons, Scots, who want to be rid of onerous nation-states, should be let to go in order to pursue and even, why not, overtake happiness, the goal, or so we Americans have always pretended to believe, of the human enterprise. So on that predictably sententious American note, I am tempted to enjoin the movers and shakers of this world to recall the Greek doctor's oath, above all, do no harm. Hippocrates also wrote, and this goes for the moved and the shaken of the world, life is short, but the art is long, the opportunity fleeting, the experiment perilous, the judgment difficult.
thank you. If Stalin were as benign as you say, then did the Gulag not exist? Were there no purges? Was the Berlin Wall simply decorative landscaping? What about East Germany in 1953, Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968? Tell us what was going on there.
I thought I just did. Never excuse your own faults by pointing to other people's. That he was a thug in regard to his own people and to the client states, that driven by fear of us, he treated badly and occupied. What I'm making the point here is the initiative was taken by us. He wanted to regularize relations with the United States, and he thought he had done it with Roosevelt. Truman, who missed the point to everything, guided by Jimmy Burns, that great cosmic thinker, managed to make every mistake in the book and to terrify Stalin. He was frightened. So he did his best he reacted always to what we did. The fact that Stalin treated his own people very, very badly is, I'm afraid, a Russian problem and not ours. We are not in the business of correcting all the governments on earth. We can't do our own, so why should we do Russia's for them? So I think it's fairly clear I am saying what happened, that we had this terrible 40 years.
Your cousin, Vice President Al Gore, has been a willing, even eager advocate of the national security state for many years. What do you think?
Well, my cousin and I have plausible deniability about each other. There are days when I don't acknowledge his existence and days when he doesn't certainly acknowledge mine. He is a perfectly standard Southern Defense Department senator in the Senate. And now all I do, I watch him standing behind Clinton, and his eyes are beginning to sparkle. For a long time, they looked rather dull. And if you notice him, there are times when, I worry about Clinton because Albert is getting closer and closer. He's going to bite one day. He just has a vampire look in his eye, and suddenly there'll be a new administration right on camera. I don't think that administration will be any different from Herbert Hoover, Harry Truman, you name it, Grover Cleveland. No, Grover Cleveland was pretty good about labor unions.
Speaking as a morally liberated Washington blue blood, what is the most serious breach of ethics committed in politics today? Are there ethics in politics anymore, assuming there ever were?
Well, the most visible change in my lifetime, and the lifetime of most people here, has been the money that is spent on campaigns, which is now obscene. And the Congress went through a very pretty dance, didn't they, over the campaign contributions. There was a lot of passion and heat in that debate. Well, the system will never change because they're paid for by corporations. I mean, it's like asking the burglar as he reaches the second floor to kick away his ladder. He is not going to do that ever. If I were optimistic, I would propose civil war, but I'm not going to.
Is any meaningful political action possible in a nation informed through television?
Well, don't leave the press out. I think they play their part, too. I don't know that you can ever learn much from television because it's so spotty. And also, you're not supposed to look into a pulsing light, which is television. It's very bad for your brain immediately goes from alpha waves, which is when you're really thinking, to beta waves, when your mind is sort of resting. And I don't know about you, it may just be, and now that I'm in the springtime of my senility, it may well be my brain is going, but simultaneously I find I often don't understand what they say. They're speaking quite clearly, and I'm one sentence behind. Then I fall 2 sentences behind. Then it gets very surrealist. No, I don't think it's an ideal method of information, but we don't have any alternative.
You said that the nation state will be replaced by the city state. Isn't the new unit of power really the multinational corporation?
Well, that's certainly true. The multinational, you know, in the old days, by old days, 30, 40 years ago, something like 45% of the revenues of the U.S. government came from the taxpayers, income tax, and about 45% came from taxes on corporate profits. 45% still comes from us, and the corporations contribute about 10%. That is why people are paid money by corporations to go to Congress to make special legislation. It's all perfectly legal, so that they don't have to pay tax. So they make no contribution, and the people make a considerable one. That is one of the problems that would have to be addressed at some point. How you curb them, I don't know. You can't find them. I did a piece a few years ago on ITT, and well, they paid no tax in America on a couple $1 billion profits. And I was told that you can't really find them. If you send a postcard to Zurich, you might get an answer, but then again, you know, they're traveling all the time. They're vacationing. ITT is probably in Hawaii now, you know, and under an assumed name. So I don't quite know how you trap them, but I certainly would like to.
What advice would you give President Clinton about his ongoing problems with the sex scandals surrounding the White House right now, its interns, etc.?
Well, now we get to the point. Thought you'd never ask. His first mistake was the famous 6-hour deposition to Ken Starr, in which asked about Monica, whom I think of. You remember that movie, Play Misty for Me? Well, there's a girl in there who tries to kill Clint Eastwood, who's a disc jockey. She's mad and looks not unlike Monica. I would be worried about her. His mistake was when asked had he had sexual relations with this enchantress, he should have said his own most famous line, "Don't ask, don't tell." In other words, Judge Starr, none of your damn business. That's what a real president would have done. Can you imagine Abraham Lincoln answering that question? George Washington's sword would be halfway through this pudgy prosecutor. You remember there was an actor called Grady Sutton, a big southern sissy with a big round face. He was always in W.C. Fields movies. He was a wonderful foil for Fields. And Fields finally turned on him one day and said, "Grady, the problem with you is you've got too much of the tomboy in you." Well, I feel that about Ken Starr. There's just too much of the tomboy in him, and he's feeling his oats. And any man who says the First Amendment is about truth should be put away in an institution, preferably the last year of high school, where you are given the Bill of Rights to read. The First Amendment is about telling lies and free speech. Truth doesn't enter into it at all. You know, there was a book not long ago called The Day That America Told the Truth, oxymoronic title, and 94% of our countrymen admitted to being habitual liars. Now, do we want an unrepresentative president? I should say not.
Mr. Vidal, you write very readable novels. Why do you give them such dull titles like Washington, D.C. and the Smithsonian Institution?
So that you would ask me that question.
Who is providing the world's intellectual leadership these days, if any?
I see nothing discernible on any horizon that I have addressed my eye to. I'm told in Latvia there are a couple of very bright guys. And there's one woman in Riga who knows everything on earth, but I can't get her address either. I think she works for ITT.
Who is your favorite author?
Oh. In my lifetime, the only writer I wholeheartedly admired was Italo Calvino, an Italian writer. Be further deponent saith not.
Well, before I ask our final question, I have some things here for you. I think
Mug.
Well, no, two of these things we've already seen before. One is a certificate of appreciation for appearing today.
Thank you.
One is our own history, the National Press Club's 90th anniversary history, which I hope you'll curl up with on the sofa.
Yes.
And you can put this on at the family homestead in Italy.
Tupperware. That's why I come here.
And for our last question today, why is it that you live in Italy anyway?
Well, I get work done there. I write there, and if I'm here, I politic all the time, which takes up a lot of time. But I also have a house in the Hollywood Hills. So, arguably, I don't live in America at all.
Well, I'd like to thank you for coming today, Mr. Vidal, and thank you all for coming. And I'd also like to thank National Press Club staff members Kate Goggin, Joanne Booz, Pat Nelson, Melanie Abdal-Dermott, and Howard Rothman for organizing today's lunch. We're adjourned. Thank you.
And by the way, Mr. Vidal will be on tomorrow's Washington Journal program. Join us here on C-SPAN starting at 7 a.m. Eastern.